We also need to understand what the Empire did with that level of control: the prejudice, the bigotry, the restrictive laws, the brutal punishments, the massacres, the genocides. The Empire was held together by violence and horror. We cannot look away from these truths. Dr. Chris Kimschel, historian. I'm Truman the Grey Merchant, and I love Star Wars. Time codes are below. The Empire did nothing wrong, or the Empire was right is a pretty common meme slash devil's advocate position slash legitimately held belief in Star Wars fan circles. It's always bothered me, but lately it's really been on my mind. In this video, I would like to dismantle it point by point with every textual example that I can find. I hope you'll stick around for the journey. As a content warning, this video will discuss all manner of fictional atrocities and acts of violence. Occasionally, when educationally relevant, I will draw comparisons to real-life events. I will do my best to present these topics thoughtfully and respectfully. Before we begin, there are a few things I feel I need to say in advance based on comments I'm predicting this will get. If anyone uncritically makes these responses below, I'll know that you didn't actually watch this video, and I will judge you with my very heart and soul. Firstly, I imagine some people will object to the very premise of this video, arguing that no one is claiming what I say they're claiming, or if they are, it's just a joke. Please let it be clear that every argument or perspective that I will critique today is one that I have personally witnessed online. Whenever possible, I will provide examples of these mentalities in the wild. And yes, I guess it's theoretically possible that every single person was joking or being ironic or doing a social experiment or some other cop-out of the cowardly. But A, I don't think these were all intended to be memes, and B, even if they were, they can still be critiqued. Comedy is as open to criticism and fact-checking as anything else. It shouldn't be used as a shield to avoid examination. If somebody is uncritically sharing crypto-fascist talking points as a bit, that warrants further discussion. 2. Why did you spend so much time on something goofy that doesn't matter? I think it does matter, for reasons I will discuss in further detail later on. Also, why are you engaging with this if you find it so silly? Glass houses, hypothetical, snarky commenter. Related to this, number 3, Star Wars isn't or wasn't political. Stop bringing up fascism. Star Wars has always been political. George Lucas has spoken at length about the specific governments and politicians who inspired the series. The Empire is very obviously inspired by Nazi Germany, among other sources. Lucas has stated so directly. Just look at their clothes and their use of the word stormtrooper as a couple of examples. Number 4, your argument is invalid because you referenced a particular piece of Star Wars media that I don't like. No major claim I make in this video is dependent on a single source. I believe that everything I claim here comes from wide trends in Star Wars, apparent over many stories from over the decades. I use both legends and canon sources. I think they are widely in agreement when it comes to what I argue. I note the source of each example, and if there's ever a discrepancy, I'll point that out as well. I reference stories that I love and stories that I don't. I'm sure you'll see stories that make you feel the same in this video, and the categorization is going to differ person to person. Again, this video is about overall trends, not specific pieces of media. Number 5, whataboutism. The flaws and missteps of the Republic, Rebels, Jedi Order, or New Republic do not justify the far, far worse ones of the Empire. Nothing they did makes the Empire's crimes acceptable, nor is the Imperial system somehow superior, for many reasons that I will talk about throughout the video. Additionally, please do not use real-world countries to somehow attempt to justify the Empire's actions. I assure you, if I'm judging a fictional government for doing something, I am judging real-world governments for doing it infinitely more. And yes, I know that I participate in a society, specifically the United States. That's one of the reasons this topic is so important to me right now. With that out of the way, let's begin. Argument 1. The Empire brings order. This is the first, but not the last, screenshot from the Screen Rant article, 15 Reasons the Galactic Empire Was Actually Good. Screen Rant isn't legitimate journalism or anything, but they're a prominent site with a big reach, making this article especially shameful. Anyway, this is perhaps the most commonly spouted point, that the Empire is a stabilizing force that's focused on law and control brought peace and stability. This is a claim that in universe the Empire regularly makes itself. Believing them is a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of fascism. The order promised by the Empire is a lie. The safety promised by the Empire is a lie. Promises, treaties, and agreements did not matter to the Empire. Laws did not matter to the Empire, its own included. Their legal system existed not to protect the public, but to justify imperial action. If the Empire wanted to do something, they would do it, with no concern for morality, legality, or prior agreements. The threat of violence was constant. Everyone was directed to report on each other. Anyone and anything could be taken and you could do nothing. Communication, art, and academia were censored and monitored. That is not order. That is anxiety manifest. The imperial system is not efficient or effective. It is intentionally bureaucratic. Infighting is intrinsic to the system. Corruption was rampant. The galaxy was trampled. The Empire would stab their biggest supporters in the back whenever it was convenient to them. The Empire often created its own enemies by forcing people into corners, either intentionally or through the consequences of their policies. The so-called order built on these principles is chaos. Here's another excerpt from The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, the book that I began this video with a quote from. It's written by a real-life historian from an in-universe perspective and was immensely helpful for this video. Officials and leaders of the Empire put a great deal of weight and emphasis on the order it supposedly brought to the galaxy. Speaking in the aftermath of the Gorman massacre, Pollux Hax, who could always be relied upon to deliver a quote justifying the unjustifiable, declared that acceptance of imperial law is the only way in which ordinary citizens can protect themselves from the dangers and violence of disorder. In many ways, Hax was correct in his assertion, for the various laws and legal systems created by the Empire were never designed or intended to be used in the service of justice. Instead, they were, like so many other tools, a weapon to be used against those who failed to comply with the required levels of obedience demanded by imperial authorities. In reality, there was no stability, safety, or security to be found within imperial laws. The Empire repeatedly changed the nature and reach of their own legal system to suit whatever circumstances or threats faced them. Those citizens who remained untouched were themselves only ever a short distance removed from finding themselves in breach of a law that had not previously existed. Systematically, most of the Empire was not built to be efficient. Infighting, backstabbing, and purges were built in and rewarded. The immense and confusing bureaucracy exists only to ensure that the wills of the highest elites were carried out. Of course, the Imperial Senate was a mess, harangued at every step, but it goes far beyond that. The departmental power structure is a variable conspiracy board. Force-sensitive attack dogs and mystic advisors hovered at the periphery, doing whatever they wanted. The military branches all hated each other. The intelligence branches all hated each other. Everyone hated the ISB. The Moff system, intended to cut through red tape, just led to Moff turf wars. Just look at how Moffs, officers, advisors, and other higher-ups were constantly battling each other for resources and prestige, happy to betray each other at a moment's notice. This was equally true within organizations, as everyone stepped on each other to gain or maintain power. The Emperor wanted it this way, as constant infighting secured his position. The Emperor was the only one who could have the full authority of ruling the Empire, while also having no interest in its day-to-day operation. The result of this was a system of hierarchy that placed the various arms and aspects of imperial governance into well-defined silos of influence and power. The purpose of these silos was to ensure that the various branches of the imperial machine would require each other to perform their own duties, while simultaneously not having clear routes of interaction between them that would enable the circumventing of the overall system. For example, the imperial military relied upon funding to maintain operations and pay the wages of soldiers. However, this funding was administered by the imperial bureaucracy and diverted out via Compnor. Planetary governors may have wished to have additional controls over military forces deployed in their regions, but the chain of command went up through the Grand Moffs and dedicated imperial advisors before it reached various military commands. Throughout this system, the opportunity to take shortcuts through proceedings is denied because the various institutions and bodies have no official means of contacting each other directly, and unofficial attempts to do so would quickly draw the attention of the relevant authorities. This system bred competition between various services and organizations rather than any desire for cooperation. Organizations tended to treat each other with varying degrees of suspicion or outright hostility, even within branches of the imperial military or between Grand Moffs. While Palpatine nominally avoided getting involved in the minutiae of the imperial state, when it came to funding for special projects, senior positions of leadership, or access to new technology, his decisions and input would have a great impact on the final outcome. As a result, different branches and senior figures would compete and jockey with each other for the Emperor's favor. And then look at how the Imperials immediately started killing each other after the Emperor died. How can a governmental structure where, from the ground up, no one trusts or respects each other, where everyone is preying on each other's downfall, be considered orderly? Warlords and criminals, the lot of them. The inherent instability of the system was also demonstrated by how many attempted coups it had. And I'm not talking about the Capital R rebellion. I mean all the times hardline Imperials internally tried to take power. Perhaps a system that rewards being a backstabbing, violent supervillain leads to this. Simultaneously, the Empire leaked supporters throughout its entire existence. Every atrocity was someone's last straw, even among former devotees. The idea that the Empire got rid of corruption is absurd. Here's a list of examples of Imperial corruption from a bunch of stories. Everyone within the Empire knew that the right bribe at the right time could open doors or close unwelcome investigations. It would appear that actually circumventing the tax system entirely and making what were sometimes termed loyalty donations either to Palpatine himself or to noted Imperial officers and officials was the best way for the rich to maintain their wealth. A form of patronage therefore existed within the Imperial hierarchy where wealthy families or companies would effectively sponsor the careers of promising young officers or pay for the construction of new naval vessels in exchange for highly preferential treatment from the state. What further undercut the Empire's visage as a state determined to uphold the just rule of law was the extent to which it was utterly riddled with corruption and close links to the various serious underground crime syndicates. It might be assumed that the Empire would be unwilling to share control of the galaxy with the various underworld powers. In some circumstances, this was true, but the Empire was a truly corrupt entity from Palpatine all the way down. In Andor, we see that Imperial-backed local security is both corrupt and actively hides criminal activity out of fear of upsetting the Empire. This is not irregular. Also note that the Imperial Senate inherited all the corruption of the Republic Senate. Corrupt figures were not removed or punished as long as their actions were in line with Imperial aims. In canon, the famously corrupt Senator Orn Freyta remained in power without issue, while the same happened in Legends with Ask. The Empire was also more than willing to work with select monopolistic corporations. The Empire did not rein in the excessively wealthy any more than the Republic did. They even expanded the powers of the corporate sector, which in Legends led to genocides and the razing of planets. It is important to understand the role that wealth played in insulating some of the richest people in the galaxy from interference by the Empire. The richest members of the upper echelons of Imperial society, generally, but not exclusively, split between those who were the inheritors of long-standing wealth and aristocratic positions, and various industrialists who had further enhanced their power and prestige through Imperial contracts. By and large, the industrial elite maintained their positions within the Empire and grew wealthier because of Imperial policies. Abuse of position was common across the Imperial hierarchy. Many of the previous corruption examples also represent this. Andor recently made headlines with its direct portrayal of an attempted sexual assault. While it was the most explicit on-screen portrayal of the topic, it was not new to Star Wars. It is not uncommon at all to see Imperials engage in sexual misconduct with people of lesser power, such as locals, prisoners, and underlings. The Imperial system did not care about these victimized people. Every time one of these abuses was prevented or ended, it was either from the survivor and their allies fighting back, or an Imperial going rogue. Another related myth of fascism in general, and the Empire in particular, is that it's a meritocracy. This is not the case, for a variety of reasons. In addition to all of the corrupt officials succeeding, positions based on nepotism and sycophancy were common. Yeah, that's the face of a nepo baby. The Empire also regularly denied promotions to qualified people, discriminating based on factors such as species, gender, class, and home planet. To clarify, I'm not advocating for a system where half the superweapon operators are women or anything. I just want to point out that a system based on arbitrary discrimination is, by definition, not a true meritocracy. I'll discuss the further extents of the Empire's discrimination further on. The Galactic Empire provided cover for those who bore virtually any conceivable prejudice. The imperial legal system is a sham, built on imprisonment without due process, often as a tactic to oppress dissidents and outsiders and/or to procure slave labor. Prisons were frequently concentration camps, where prisoners were expected to die, if not just killed directly. Arbitrary, indefinite, and excessive punishment is not law and order. It's the opposite. However, in reality, there was no stability, safety, or security to be found within imperial laws. The Empire repeatedly changed the nature and reach of their own legal system to suit whatever circumstances or threats faced them. To reiterate, the laws existed to serve the Empire, not protect the citizenry. We've now discussed many examples of the Empire's false order, where corruption and abuse flourished. It should also be noted that in addition to allowing and enabling this disorder, the Empire actively caused chaos and criminality with regularity. Again, in Andor, we recently saw them intentionally antagonize and provoke the Gorman locals to justify cracking down on them and further taking the planet. They go so far as to shoot their own people to trick them into shooting into the crowd. This duplicity is a common Imperial tactic. Legends calls one version of this a political gain operation. PGOs are terrorist missions held on worlds where native sympathies vacillate between the Empire and the Rebellion. In a typical PGO, the Special Missions troops stage several terrorist attacks, executed in a manner which would suggest that political factions native to the world could have produced the attacks. Eventually, some political faction will appeal to the planetary governor for help. The governor will declare martial law. The help arrives in the form of hundreds or thousands of additional troops. These troops operate on new intelligence, rounding up scores of suspected or known rebel sympathizers for imprisonment or execution. Once the rebels are out of the way, the attacks cease, reinforcing the impression that the rebellion indeed sponsored the attacks. Similarly, in canon, the Empire was known to plant weapons as a justification for planetary takeover. They were also known to inflame pre-existing local conflicts as an excuse to take more power. The Empire also had no qualms about working with criminals and other unsavory types when it benefited them. In an iconic scene from The Empire Strikes Back, Admiral Piet says of bounty hunters, "We don't need their scum." He was about 2 decades too late. The Empire regularly employed bounty hunters from the very beginning, officially allying with the Bounty Hunters Guild. In Legends, the Empire also licensed and supported privateers, state-sponsored pirates. In canon, we see both the Imperial Remnant and the First Order fund piracy as a protection racket. Many Imperials also quickly turned to piracy and raiding of their own as the Empire collapsed. The Empire also had a long-standing relationship with Jabba and the Hutt cartel. In canon, the Empire allowed the vast criminal enterprise to operate with minimal oversight, affording them special privileges in return for their support. In Legends, the Empire similarly generally chose not to disrupt Hutt operations. They also happily worked with pirates, slavers, spice runners, and robbers, like the Black Sun Syndicate, Pike Syndicate, and various smaller outfits. The Empire also had its own criminal pursuits. In canon, Zarek Besh was an arm of the Imperial Security Bureau masquerading as a criminal organization. Their stated goal to gather intelligence was overshadowed by murder, drug running, and gambling. The idea that the Rebel Alliance was uniquely crime-affiliated compared to the Empire is therefore entirely unfounded. The view that the Empire brings peace is itself demonstrably untrue. Beyond their intentional destabilizations and criminal dealings, they longed for war. Their own in-universe handbook states that war is the natural order of things. The Empire is endlessly blood-hungry, fueled by expansion, trampling over anyone in their way. This is a system doomed to eventually collapse. Another sign that the Imperial system isn't preferable is just how often we see people's quality of lives demonstrably worsen as a result of Imperial action. In Jedi Fallen Order, a member of the Scrappers Guild states that the Empire pays worse. Elsewhere, we hear and see that the job has become significantly more dangerous. The simultaneous increase in danger and decrease in compensation, combined with rapid environmental destruction, was commonplace across the galaxy, from industrial workers to farmers. Homelessness, refugeeism, and slum conditions were ever present. Unions were targeted. Legal slavery proliferated. I don't know why it's a recurring misconception that the empire ended slavery.
Efficiency was seen as being of paramount importance. The safety of the workers and the protection of planetary habitats was not. As might be expected, all forms of trade and workers' unions were dismantled and made illegal. While most laws and regulations that had governed workers' safety in the Republic were stripped away. Of the new regime's currency change, all their existing savings and wealth were rendered obsolete. Shops would not accept, for fear of punishment from the security forces, newly declared illegal currencies in exchange for even basic items like food, and most businesses could no longer pay their own workers. The arrival of imperial credits led to issues of price inflation given the scarcity of legal tender. The result of this localized financial collapse was a significant part of the population joining imperial service, either through military recruitment or heading into industrial jobs that could at least guarantee a usable currency. Both outcomes were ultimately beneficial to the empire, as alternative employment sectors collapsed, leaving people to depend on the state for survival. Quality of life also decreased in less obvious ways. Food shortages and full-on starvation were common. Art and media, now heavily censored, got worse. The empire also regularly intentionally targeted areas of religious and cultural importance, committing cultural genocide. Frontier life in the Republic had always been restrictive and only became more so under the empire. Opportunities and funding for education, travel, and many alternative careers were often controlled by planetary governors on a case-by-case basis to force their population down particular avenues that benefited the empire. In the Priscilla system, for example, Governor Hast Olam closed many industries to ensure that the now unemployed civilian population would enter the strategically important mines as the only employment option. Such arrangements appear to have been extremely common across the Outer Rim territories. The topic of worsening conditions brought on by the empire must lead to a discussion on their genocides, massacres, war crimes, and crimes against sentience. The depth and width of their evil are so large that it is difficult to condense and categorize all of their relevant actions. Notably, this is how real fascism operates as well. Here is an incomplete list, organized by continuity, then alphabetical order of location or species, of imperial violence against populations with a large civilian component. Any argument that the empire is a stabilizing force requires ignoring their atrocities to a comical degree. Like with real fascism, their proponents are driven by the statistically false assumption that this system will put them on top. Every argument for the empire takes the perspective of the minuscule population making up the elite of this apartheid state. If you existed in the Star Wars galaxy, by the numbers, it is incredibly unlikely that you would be in a comfortable position within the empire. You would probably be a non-human, perhaps facing genocide, perhaps merely facing enslavement and or other types of oppression. If you did happen to be a human, you'd probably be a farmer or laborer toiling in dangerous conditions with excessive quotas, your planet's resources extracted for the imperial machine. If empathy for the downtrodden isn't enough to motivate you, please realize that fascism will not give you actual power. It will give you scapegoats and distractions as it tramples you. There's a good piece of contrast and resistance between the experiences of a human and a non-human. In one scene, the human shares that they have a positive view of the empire because their grandfather got a job in an imperial weapons factory that put food on the table. In the preceding episode, a Nikto shares his generational trauma of violence against his people. That's imperial prosperity. Worsen labor conditions and availability, hold these limited opportunities over a percentage of your people, and oppress everyone else even more. Rise and Fall points out that any trains running on time style benefits were built on the suffering of the many to serve the convenience of a few. Also, for what it's worth, the Mussolini train line is poorly supported. The wealth and resources and prosperity dragged from outlying worlds allowed the galaxy's rulers on Coruscant to enjoy opulent lifestyles, while also ensuring that the Star Destroyers and Stormtrooper legions that the totalitarian system relied upon would continue to be funded. Some of the Empire's fiercest defenders point toward the industrial and transportation networks created during these years as things built by the Empire to benefit the populations of Imperial worlds. But it takes a very creative definition to consider that any of these things were built by the Empire. Imperial officials did not do the labor. They did not do the mining. Wookiees in stun cuffs toiling in forced labor camps and impoverished populations digging for dunium deep beneath the surface of Outer Rim worlds were not the Empire. The systems they were creating were not for the benefit of ordinary people either. Armed convoys taking resources towards the core were not pleasure cruises. Low-paying jobs did not allow civilians to take exotic excursions on the new hyperlanes. And weapons factories spewing toxins into the atmosphere did not enrich their sick, impoverished workers. The Empire sat at the center of the galaxy like an enormous black hole, forever sucking wealth and resources inward. Coruscant glittered while those at the edges suffered. Wards who had nothing left to give were abandoned to their fate and allowed to go dark. If the Empire was truly a benevolent institution of order and prosperity, its defeat would not have been celebrated so strongly by so many so immediately. From its own capital, to the Emperor's homeworld, to the very outskirts of the galaxy. Finally, crediting the Empire for ending the Clone Wars is stupid when the entire point of 4 movies and many seasons of television were that the Clone Wars were entirely manufactured to justify the Empire's rise. Argument 2. The rebels are terrorists. Presenting the rebels as terrorists is a common, edgy, but actually tired take, right up with, why didn't they just fly the Eagles to Mordor? For neither the first nor the last time in this video, people seriously proclaiming this are falling for in-universe propaganda. And yes, if terrorism is defined as any armed resistance to a government ever, then I guess the rebels are terrorists. But that is a ridiculously unnuanced definition that requires ignoring everything about the franchise. A discussion on the legitimacy of rebel violence requires understanding that the Empire removed all other options for enacting change. Within the system, even the meager powers afforded to the Senate were subject to alteration from imperial governors and advisors, or a simple veto by Palpatine. Senators were also subject to threats, surveillance, and arrests. The delegation of 2000 were a group of senators formed during the Clone Wars to oppose Palpatine's overreaching of power. In both continuities, 63 of their members were immediately arrested after the Empire's rise. Military officers were also arrested. Some of these people were tortured and executed or assassinated. Some weren't even senators anymore, just civilians living quietly. Families were arrested and enslaved. All of this was before the creation of the Rebel Alliance. These people were silenced solely for their prior criticism of Palpatine. Some of the disappeared were even past supporters of Palpatine who shirked at the new system. Many bystanders were killed in these assassination attempts. Imagine arresting Swiat Conquerkill, of all people. His name is a misnomer. He's a chill dude. After the Imperial Senate was dissolved, all current and some past senators were arrested. 20 were sentenced to death. Simultaneously, all external options for dissent or even questioning were removed. The democratic process was removed. Protesting was criminalized. Honest journalism was criminalized. Transmissions, art, media, and academia were censored. Statements of even vague or accidental opposition or frustration were considered treasonous, and often resulted in violence and imprisonment. Torturous, mind-ruining re-education was a constant threat. When a gratuitously violent system removes literally all options for non-violent dissent, how can violent dissent be judged? We continually see that the Rebel Alliance maintains far stronger standards of engagement than the Empire. In canon, they broke ties with factions that targeted civilians or committed war crimes. In Legends, they refused membership to former separatist war criminals. It should also be noted that if you define terrorism as creating terror, the label applies to the Empire dramatically. In A New Hope, Tarkin explicitly lays out the plan to scare the galaxy into subservience with the threat of planetary destruction. This ideology of ruling through fear is called the Tarkin Doctrine, and the Empire was suicidally devoted to it. A related take is that destroying Imperial superweapons was somehow problematic. I don't think there's ever been a more legitimate military target in fiction than the Death Stars. Your Honor, it's called the Death Star. In Legends, it was built on the slave world of despair. It is not subtle that its nature is death. There's a good moment in The Mandalorian where an Imperial gets upset with a former rebel over the destruction of the Death Star, mere moments after mocking her about Alderaan. How can destroying a battle station that killed billions, with operators who actively plan to kill billions more, be presented as the greater evil? Fan attempts to humanize stormtroopers and other low-ranking Imperials at the expense of the rebels miss that it's the Empire that does the dehumanizing. We all laugh at stormtrooper marksmanship and non-Ewok-proof armor, but it does demonstrate the recurring fact that in-universe they have shoddy equipment and very mixed quality training. Standard TIE fighters were death traps without shielding or life support. Their pilots had life expectancies of less than a year. Fatigue, disillusionment, and low morale were commonplace. The Empire also continued and furthered the Republic's great sin, the clone army, churning through them and then discarding them when they were no longer useful. The Empire was well known for meat grinder battle tactics in general. One of the Legends coup attempts I mentioned earlier was conducted by the headmaster of the Imperial Academy, who couldn't stand to see any more of his students die for the Empire's expansion. Even training resulted in frequent deaths. Imperial higher-ups also had no qualms about their own forces being caught up in Imperial violence. In canon, 500,000 troops and their families were killed for not supporting the centralized Imperial government after Palpatine's death. In one of Star Wars TV's best scenes, an ex-Imperial is confronted with his former superior's indifference to the 5,000 to 10,000 Imperials caught up in the Empire's destruction of Burnin Kon. Loyalty purges were also common, creating an atmosphere of fear. Finally, it should be noted that even lower-ranked Imperials were, by design, complicit in Imperial atrocities. Not every stormtrooper individually gunned down a civilian, but each was expected to, trained to, ready to. The good stormtroopers defected. Argument 3. Yuzhan Vong nonsense. This is a legend-specific argument that takes a bit more explanation. In that continuity, the Yuzhan Vong were a species of extragalactic invaders who decimated the galaxy during the era of the New Republic. They were the primary antagonists of the expanded universe for years. Eventually, it was revealed that back in his Supreme Chancellor days, Palpatine learned of the Vong's existence. In-universe, a biased individual trying to recruit Thrawn claims that Palpatine's actions are intended to prepare the galaxy for the oncoming Vong. Later Imperials parrot this conspiracy theory. This minor detail, which was greatly ambiguous at best in the actual text, somehow became a major fan belief. At the absolute most, Palpatine just didn't want somebody else playing with his toys. He had no empathy or care for the people of the galaxy, even pragmatically. Even if we take this motivation as true, which I don't think we should, it doesn't justify the Empire's atrocities. The common wording is that Palpatine toughened up the galaxy. That is straight-up abuser logic. Starving, killing, and traumatizing the galaxy did not toughen it up. Also, he doesn't get points for supposedly preparing the galaxy if he intentionally hid the specifics of this oncoming disaster. An extension of this argument is that the Empire would have been technologically or militarily better equipped to defeat the Vong than the New Republic. Legend's later years actually verge on fascism apologetics, with how much they awkwardly try to whitewash the Empire's crimes. But even there, this idea is challenged. Han Solo argues that the Empire would probably fail in the scenario of still being the primary power in the galaxy during the Vong invasion. As evidence, he points to all the times they failed in the past. It's worth mentioning that the Imperial Remnant themselves only meaningfully organized against the Vong reluctantly after being directly attacked. I would also add that if the Empire's massive military buildup was actually to defend against this outside force, they shouldn't have spent decades burning through their resources fighting their own citizens. Argument 4. The problem was Darth Sidious. This argument is that, sure, Darth Sidious was a Sith weirdo, but the underlying Imperial system was ideal. If someone like Thrawn, Pelion, Rogarus, or some other good Imperial was in charge, everything would be fine.
There will always be those who are prepared to accelerate the death of democracy if they believe power is being given to someone worthy.
The most immediate problem with this line of thinking is that the Empire was rotten from the top down. It took countless people to plan and execute the Empire's atrocities. Blame was owed to far more than just Palpatine. No Nuremberg defenses here. The most popular good Imperial candidates were still war criminals,
or at least war criminal collaborators. In Legends, Thrawn is introduced as a war destroyer who is now violently manipulating the Nogri, and he doesn't fare any better in canon. He also had clear interpersonal weaknesses that people tend to overlook. Pelion was a violent authoritarian even after his so-called reforms of the Empire. Rogris only reached his limit when the Imperial Remnant wanted him to lie about not bombarding a planet that he knew they would, not when the Empire was bombarding countless planets previously. The whole thing strongly reminds me of the real-life myth of the clean Wehrmacht, which incorrectly attempts to pin Nazi war crimes solely on the SS.
Regardless of all the wider justifications of order and peace, in most ways the Empire was built and predicated on cruelty and complicity. Virtually all who existed within it suffered from this cruelty, but it was not delivered remotely, or just conjured into being because Palpatine wished it so. It was perpetrated by the ordinary people who facilitated the Imperial system. Every stormtrooper who used lethal force when it wasn't needed. Every administrative official who abused their power. Every fleet officer who opened fire with indiscriminate barrages. Cruelty permeated the Empire. Relatedly, I've always found it very funny when people point to the eventual non-human stormtroopers in the Legends continuity as evidence of the Imperial successors becoming more progressive. I'm not going to be impressed that they diversified their faceless death army, because their rampant expansionism and disregard for their own people churned through so many humans that they couldn't afford to discriminate as much anymore. Finally, it needs to be said that the entire Imperial system was set up in a way so that there could be no replacement of or clean continuation to Palpatine. That's how dictatorships work. A great deal of time, effort, and violence had been spent ensuring that nobody but Palpatine could ever sit upon the throne. Argument 5. The Empire is better because they look cooler. This is a quick one because it's especially stupid. I'm not going to deny that the Empire has a strong aesthetic. I'm also not going to pretend that I don't have some of their toys. If people have a fandom preference for that reason, sure. But I encourage people to look at the inspirations behind that aesthetic before they use it to argue for political superiority. Fascists use style to substitute for substance. There remained under the New Republic groups who idolized the Imperial aesthetic and tried to present a clean version of the Imperial military, which championed their training and military effectiveness, while ignoring their war crimes and atrocities. This should not be allowed to stand unopposed. There remains room to further explore how the largest armed forces the galaxy has ever known were organized, trained, and deployed, while also making clear exactly what they were intended to achieve. Argument 6. The Empire only lost because of plot armor. The thinking behind this is that if Star Wars was realistic, the Empire would win. Putting aside the feasibility of determining what's realistic in a setting with space wizards, I think this misunderstands the nature of Imperial philosophy. Being bad at tactics is what makes the Empire the Empire. As demonstrated and discussed throughout this video, suicidal overconfidence, style over substance, over-reliance on doctrine, meat grinder strategies, egotistical leadership, and debilitating infighting are all part of the Imperial DNA. The tensions within different branches of the Imperial military, divisions and disagreements over how best to utilize or deploy its forces, and the limitations of various parts of key military hardware would all combine to dramatically complicate its ability to wage war. Though the massed forces of the Empire's military were a truly terrifying entity capable of subjugating huge swaths of the galaxy, it was not an agile or particularly intuitive organization. Too often it found itself hobbled by the weaknesses and limitations of its leaders. The ability to adequately do your job within the military was quite often viewed as less important than demonstrable loyalty, the ability to unquestioningly follow orders or political connections. It did not matter how cutting-edge the weapons assigned to the military were if those commanding them did not know how best to use them. Them being competent would require a fundamental rewriting of their basic characterization. If they were smart enough to have better tactics, they'd have been smart enough to not have done a lot of things. It reminds me of alt history theorists who say the Nazis would have won if they just did one thing differently. And that one thing ends up being every ideological and strategic decision they made over their entire existence. With the Empire, I would go so far as to say their defeat was inevitable. Nimick was right. The Imperial need for control is so desperate because it is so unnatural. Tyranny requires constant effort. It leaks. It breaks. Authority is brittle. Oppression is the mask of fear. Remember that. And know this. The day will come
when all these skirmishes and battles, these moments of defiance, will have flooded the banks of the Empire's authority, and then there will be one too many. One single thing will break the siege. Or, more simply, the more you tighten your grip, Tarkin, the more star systems will slip through your fingers. Fascism is weak, cowardly, and self-defeating. People will grasp for freedom eventually. It is in our nature to fight for it. Maybe victory will be tomorrow. Maybe it will be in a year. Maybe it will be in 100 years. But it will come. Keep fighting. Thank you for watching. This video was a big undertaking, researched, written, and filmed over almost a year. This message is very meaningful to me, and I hope putting this video out will do some small good in these difficult times. I look forward to further civil discussions in the comments. I'd like to recognize some of my inspirations, such as Dr. Kim Shaw and the many other contributors to this franchise, and thoughtful Star Wars content creators, like Corey's Datapad and Star Wars Explained. I would also like to celebrate everyone who has worked to organize and archive out-of-print Star Wars media. Thank you, RPG Sourcebook Scanners. You are true heroes of the Rebellion. If you enjoyed listening to me talk about Star Wars, I was on the great podcast, What Does Star Wars Mean to You?, a while back. Thank you to my patrons for their continued support. I'll end things with my favorite Star Wars quote. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Take care.